The capacity of a country to resist invasion is driven by a large number of factors. It can be geography, economics, allies, weapon systems, and the strength of that nation's armed forces. But equally significant is the willingness of the population of that country to resist. And it's on that topic that Russian invasion plans for Ukraine seem to have made some assumptions. It does seem as if many in the Russian military and political class either expected or at the very least hoped that they would be greeted as liberators, with flowers thrown before them as the Russian army came as liberators from fascism. Instead, every length of road became a potential ambush site, as regular Ukrainian citizens in volunteer units or territorial defence augmented the regular army to make the Russian advance hell. Across the country, volunteers took up arms by the hundreds of thousands, while in the cities, citizens mixed Molotov cocktails or prepared tank traps and barriers. You know, the way you traditionally greet welcome liberators. In a previous video, I've discussed one of Russia's main failings in this war, namely the shortage of capable, trained and motivated infantry. Foot sloggers, grunts, assault elements, the people that are needed in order to allow Russia to make the most of its massive superiority in tanks and artillery. At the time, I said that Ukraine's situation was almost directly inverse, so I wanted to look at that one today. I want to look at the situation of a country which has mobilised and has no shortage of men and women willing to fight for their country, but instead one where the primary barriers to success are things like training, equipment and logistics. So what am I going to be covering today? I am going to look at Ukraine's mobilisation system and a little bit of an overview of Ukraine's army reforms between 2014 and 2022, because they really play into the experience of the army today. Then I'm going to look at their mobilisation experience, how they've succeeded in calling up reservists and volunteers, and what state the Ukraine army finds itself in now with regards to manpower. Then I'm going to start looking at issues, two specifically to begin with: the shortage of equipment and also the training difficulty of trying to get hundreds of thousands of new recruits trained up and capable of serving effectively in support of military operations. Then I'll close out with some final observations and findings. There will of course be plenty of caveats. After all, it is a big war, and for every example I give, you can find a counterexample in most cases. But when I gloss over something or I'm using specific sources, I will try and call that out. Now, before we jump into it, a word from the sponsor for today's video. Today's sponsor is Morning Brew. Now, Morning Brew is a free daily newsletter that drops every day, Monday to Sunday. It strives to get you up to speed on business, finance, and tech in 5-minute summary form. Considering how many of us open our day by reaching for our phones, it's handy to have a news summary right there and available. They strive to be witty, relevant, informative, and succinct, all things that I continue to struggle with. In one recent newsletter, I was treated to news that US inflation was actually now slowing, contrary to Russian assurances that the West was close to inevitable economic collapse. And I got a reminder that I may have jumped the gun on last week's video, considering the recent attack on Saki Air Base. Not bad for a 5-minute read. And signing up really couldn't be easier. It's free and it takes about 15 seconds, which is plenty quick if you're the sort of person who watches my videos. So if you're interested in business or finance or tech, there really is no reason not to give it a shot. The link is morningbrewdaily.com/Perun. If you are interested, that link is also down in the description. And thanks again to the team at Morning Brew for their support. So as is often the case, let's open with a little bit of history. Specifically the history of mobilisation systems and specifically Ukraine's mobilisation system. Because nations have long understood that you kind of need a larger military when you're at war than when you're at peace for obvious reasons. It's not productive to just have millions upon millions of troops sitting around digging ditches and filling them in again during peacetime when they could otherwise be doing other productive things. At the same time, it kind of takes time to train people, form military units and convert volunteers or conscripts into combat power. That's where mobilisation comes in. It's the idea of creating a system whereby you train people during peacetime, you stockpile equipment, and you put in place structures to rapidly call those people back to the colours from their civilian jobs during a time of war, with them mostly pre-trained and perhaps only needing some refreshers. The 20th century gave us some incredibly extreme examples of mobilisation systems, particularly in Europe, where countries like, first Prussia, and then Germany, France, Russia, the Soviet Union, etc., developed systems for very rapidly in times of war, putting millions of men who had been pre-trained during their conscript service back into uniform in pre-formed units on trains and assembled for combat duty extremely rapidly. Now, maintaining a system like that is both expensive and also puts a lot of impositions on the population in terms of service periods, training requirements, refresher training, and also stockpiled equipment. So very few nations actually keep those sort of intensive systems to this day. There are some examples. Finland and Israel are two examples that spring to mind, but for the most part, countries don't tend to go to the same extremes they once did, and that's probably a good thing. But the Soviet Union loved the idea of mobilization. Now, while the Cold War era Soviet army had many visible flaws, at least from a Western perspective, it was designed with mobilization in mind. Very few divisions in the Soviet army were anything close to fully manned at any given time. In fact, many units in different categories, so Category B or Category C divisions, had only a tiny fraction of their manpower available at any given time. Instead, what you would have is cadres, officers attached to a unit and small numbers of permanent personnel who do things like maintain equipment. You'd have entire vehicle parks, and the idea was, in time of war, someone would hit the metaphorical button. And assuming no one hit the button that said nukes and destroyed the world, what would happen on calling mobilization is millions of Soviet citizens would be rushed back to their units. They would be joined up with these cadres to rapidly bring these units up to full strength, and out of seemingly nowhere, fully formed combat-capable divisions of Warsaw Pact troops would form. The Soviets didn't have 50,000 tanks because they kept them all manned at any given time. They had 50,000 tanks because in times of war, they needed something for their reservists to drive. Now, such a system has huge drawbacks to it, obviously. You've got a whole bunch of units that you're spending money on that can't really do anything during peacetime. Unless you're willing to mobilize, a lot of units don't have any combat power, really. And you've got a bunch of officers sitting around in a very top-heavy military that have basically no enlisted personnel a lot of the time. So you end up with these huge parks of vehicles being maintained and large numbers of officers on payroll, but very few combat-capable units, unless you hit the mobilization button. But the advantage is very simple. If World War III kicks off in Europe, then the Soviet Union can call up a very large army very quickly and make that beeline for the River Rhine. The Ukrainian military is born out of this old Soviet system. At the time it gains independence, Ukraine has an army of about 750,000 men, something like 6,000 tanks, and also a whole bunch of nuclear weapons. But in the 20 plus years that follow, that military system decays rapidly and nearly completely. The farce that was 2014 is a matter of record. The Ukrainian army by that time had been hollowed out, its equipment was a joke, training standards were low, and the military was full of officers with Russian sympathies or leanings and very few combat-capable units. When the Russians went into Crimea, there was basically no resistance. That was a wake-up call. That was a serious wake-up call for the Ukrainians, who saw both that their territorial integrity had been breached and also that their army needed serious reform. But the key point is that the old Soviet mobilization system and concept of category divisions and cadres didn't really survive the reform process. Instead, you had the Ukrainian army itself being basically rebuilt from the ground up. You had other organizations like the National Guard of Ukraine and the Territorial Defense Forces, with the intention being that the TDF would have a certain number of permanent personnel during peacetime, and then it would absorb volunteer personnel during wartime in order to serve a local defense and reserve function. We've seen that this obviously made the army a heck of a lot more effective than it was in 2014, but there's 2 points that I want to call out. The first is this did not make Ukraine a NATO army. Russians love to call Ukraine a NATO army. It's not. It's a Ukrainian army. It's an army in transition. It still has hallmarks of the old system married with the new way of doing things. It was also very well configured for locally controlled local defense, but not so well organised when it came to getting hundreds of thousands of people into uniform, as we'll see in a moment. So come February 2022, what systems were in place and what did the Ukrainian mobilisation experience look like? And as I go through this overview, keep two things in mind. The first is that there is a relationship here between the army, the Territorial Defence Forces, the National Guard, and other parts of the Ukrainian government. So when I say people are volunteering or being called up, don't assume I'm only talking about the army itself. The second thing is that Ukraine had something of a saving grace in that there are several 100,000 veterans in the country who had served in the army previously and who had fought in the Donbass, or the Joint Forces area, prior to February 2022. Now, while these individuals aren't going to be perhaps as useful as people whose skills are still sharp because they're on active duty at the time that war broke out, it still meant that there was a base of volunteers and reservists to draw from early who had at least some military experience, specifically fighting Russians or Russian proxies. With that said, Ukraine declared general mobilization on February 24th, along with travel restrictions that prevented men between the ages of 18 and 60 leaving the country. And I think this stands out as one of the signalling moments of the early war, along with Zelensky refusing to evacuate Kyiv, the Russian offensive against the Ukrainian capital and thus the hope for a quick victory being halted, and the first large deliveries of weapons from Western states. Taken together, a declaration of mobilization, coupled with some initial success on the battlefield, demonstrated a willingness of Ukraine to resist. And when that happened, the most optimistic versions of the Russian war plans were dead and buried. There are no quick victories against millions of people determined to resist. But as important as this was as a political signal, it's important to recall that this wasn't a World War I or World War II style mobilization system. It was not the Cold War era USSR. It is not modern Israel. There was no structure in place to instantly call up hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and put them into uniform. Volunteers could be rapidly absorbed into the TDF as planned, but even that process had its limits. So when mobilization was called, it began in waves. And to paraphrase a couple of Ukrainians who I've talked to about this stage of the war, the opening stages of mobilization were, frankly, a bit of a shit show. This is the stage of the war where Ukrainians are driving civilian cars past convoys of Russian vehicles and throwing Molotov cocktails at them. This is the stage of the war where plainclothes Ukrainian civilians are strapping on armbands and going out in civilian clothes just to cause trouble. This is the stage of the war where Ukraine is handing out AKs to anyone who will accept one if they say they're willing to help defend Kyiv. Now, the Territorial Defense Force expands by 100,000 volunteers in the first month, but you also have this wild proliferation of volunteer units and militias across Ukraine with the intention of defending their immediate location or going out and causing trouble. In fact, so great is the surge of volunteers in the early stages of the war that you have cases of the Army and the Territorial Defense Forces telling ready, able-bodied volunteers, "I'm sorry, we're full, we can't look after you right now, we don't have a spare opening, come back another time." The country is being invaded, the capital is under threat, and the Army and Territorial Defense have so many recruits available to them that they're having to turn some away. There are anecdotal cases of people trying to pay bribes in order to jump the queue to get into the Territorial Defense Force. And you've got stories of volunteer units around Kyiv going out, making contact with the Russians, taking very heavy casualties, heading back for the night, and picking up a whole slew of new volunteers who know exactly what just happened and say they want in. And so you get to April, and the obligation of the call-up for mobilization still only applies to actual reservists. There's no call-up mandate for individuals that are not reservists by that time. To put this in an American context, this isn't even really a draft yet. It's just calling up the equivalents of the National Guard, the Army Reserve, and the State Guard. But I do need to attach two important caveats when we're talking about this early phase. The first is there were grossly different experiences of mobilization and volunteering at the local level. This was often quite a very local process, and so you have situations where the volunteering and call-up process went very well, people got streamed into their units appropriately, they got formed up, equipped, and were capable of going into action relatively quickly. You had other cases where it was badly mismanaged. People were put in the wrong roles, equipment wasn't available, and units were sent into action with inadequate training or inadequate equipment. I'll also say that people are people. So you do get a few stories of people trying to do things like bribe their way across the border to avoid potential service, or deliberately enlisting in local units in order to avoid potential service requirements in the army, where there's a greater probability of being sent to the front. In a country of 40 million people, there is going to be diversity of response and experience. But the overarching picture, the big picture, was that Ukraine was drowning in volunteers in this early stage and was struggling to absorb, equip, and train them all. Now, in some cases, they waited patiently for their chance to be integrated, and in other cases, Pavel and his mates just grabbed a couple of AKs, shotguns, and whatever rocket launchers they could steal to go out and cause trouble for the Ruskies themselves. I'm not sure drive-by Molotov cocktail attacks on armoured vehicles are in anyone's military manual, but we saw a couple of those in the early stages of the war. This was resistance as much as it was mobilisation. The mobilisation problem evolved through some serious teething issues in the weeks and months that followed. There were cases, for example, several cases of units being pushed forward before they were trained and ready. In theory, recently called up territorial defence units or volunteer units should mostly be used on second or third line duties and be given a degree of training and equipment before they're sent into combat. In some cases, territorial defence units formed properly and performed brilliantly. While their achievements may have been exaggerated at times, there is certainly a significant body of evidence that they did fantastic work in the defence of Kyiv, for instance. In some cases, things were a little more dire. There are some fantastic videos done by Colonel Markus Reisner of the Austrian Bundesheer, who documents and notes some cases of territorial defence units being put into the line before they were properly trained and readied, with inadequate artillery support, and also not being rotated out of the line and eventually suffering combat fatigue and in some cases breaking. I mention this not to attack the Ukrainian army so much as to point out the desperation and also the deep local variability in the early stages of the war, right up to the recent fighting in the Donbass. You have units that are able to get training properly, either from veteran soldiers or from fallen volunteers or from other sources, that are able to get the equipment they need in order to be combat effective and are then pushed into situations that match their levels of training, equipment, and combat capability. And you have situations where, for whatever reason, units are pushed forward with inadequate equipment and inadequate training and suffer as a result. The key macro observation is that there is order slowly coming to chaos over time. You see fewer and fewer plain-clothed militia units going out and staging impromptu ambushes, and more semi-organised or fully organised, decently equipped units augmenting a regular army which has itself suffered significant casualties. And of course, total Ukrainian manpower continues to increase. As the months went by, slowly, steadily, some order came to the chaos, and the number of volunteers that were called to the colours steadily increased. And again, this isn't to say the process has been fixed. There's a lot of reporting, and I will link some of it, which shows there are still issues with things like transparency and bureaucracy getting in the way of effective mobilisation. And of course, you're always going to have some opposition to things like drafting people or imposing travel restrictions. But at a strategic level, the picture is obvious. You saw fewer and fewer plain-clothed units fighting with whatever civilian guns they could pull together, and more units that looked like supporting or reserve elements for a regular army. Although those of you who follow the Ukraine war closely will notice that there really is no such thing as uniform regulation on the front in Ukraine. It's all kind of guidelines at best. I do sometimes wonder how the German army feels about the fact that Ukrainian crews are seen operating Panzerhaubitzen wearing open footwear. And this is a good chance to look quickly at the role of women in Ukrainian mobilization, because this has been subject to some Russian disinformation efforts. Women already served in combat roles in the Ukrainian army before February 2022. They made up, I believe, about 15% of the army, although I stand to be corrected on that point. They were also allowed in some combat roles. There were female artillery crews, there were female tank commanders, there were female snipers, you name it. Somewhere in the Ukrainian military there was probably a woman doing it. There were some fake Russian documents that circulated for a while claiming that by the end of June, Ukraine would be mass conscripting women. That obviously didn't happen. Women are currently serving in the Ukrainian army, but as volunteers, similarly in the TDF. And there are plenty of videos out there of Ukrainian women doing everything from firing Stugin missiles at Russian armoured vehicles to commanding tanks. So far as conscription goes, it's not currently happening, although Ukraine does have a requirement for some women to register for a potential draft. In late 2021, Order 313 required women in certain trades and professions to register for potential conscription in time of war. You look at the list of professions and you see where they're going with this. Medical professions, communications. Basically, it was a range of professions that would have military utility in time of war, so you might want to call them up so that you could direct additional military manpower, for example, to the front. In July of this year, that list was updated. I've got the relevant document on screen there. So they increased the number of professions that needed to register, and there's some provision for activity from October the 1st. When more information on the potential future mobilisation of women becomes available, I will surface it, but it's probably not going to look like throwing 60-year-olds into the trenches the way the Russian documents suggest. So no, the Ukrainians are not sending old babushkas to the trenches to fight off the Russian invasion, Kalashnikov in hand. Although I feel like if they did, two things would happen in pretty quick succession. The first is the quality of food at the front would probably increase massively, and the second is the war probably would be over in a week or two. I mean, I am not convinced there is a piece of military equipment yet designed that has half the endurance, toughness, or reliability as a babushka. And the reason I'm pretty confident in saying we won't have any babushkas at the front is because demography and mobilization go hand in hand. If you're in the Russian situation and you're trying to operate an all-volunteer or nominally all-volunteer army in a war setting, then what you care about primarily is the number of volunteer recruits that you can attract. When you declare general mobilization, the limits become more how many people of the appropriate age and cadres do you have in your country, what are your economical limits, whose labour can you replace, etc. Because you can require people to fight. Not that Ukraine has had to require many people given the vast numbers of volunteers that they had available to them. Depending on the assumptions that you make around the movements of Ukrainian population since 2021, Ukraine probably has somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million men in their 20s available for military service. Now, when you account for the fact that factors which usually render people ineligible for military service, like severe obesity, are much rarer in Ukraine than in countries like the United States, plus the fact that during wartime you're usually willing to waive some of your restrictions around, say, education requirements or health because you can put them into rear area jobs, then a significant part of that cadre is probably suitable for military service in some way or another. And the second largest cohort of men in Ukraine is actually men in their 30s. And this is not even getting into the military potential of 18 or 19-year-olds, of people who are in their 40s or 50s, or women, as I mentioned before. There are millions of potential recruits that the Ukrainian military can draw on at a time when unemployment in the country is quite high. Even relatively early in the war, you see pro-Russian sources start to raise a sense of alarm about the fact that Ukraine is quite rapidly raising several 100,000 new personnel to serve in the military or to support military operations. The other point about mobilization, and one that is often missed, is the people you get during general mobilization or a popular call-up, the way you tend to get when a country is attacked as opposed to when it launches an imperialist war overseas, is you get a different sort of person joining the colours. Modern militaries need technical experts, and technical experts are some of the most difficult personnel to attract and retain during peacetime. Because people who have mechanical engineering qualifications or IT qualifications or other technical specifications, specialized skills essentially, have lots of options available to them in the civilian sector, or indeed in the Ukrainian context, they'll have a lot of options to potentially go overseas and ply their trade in markets with much higher salary rates. When you look at the people that Russia is able to attract into its volunteer battalions, it's got a disproportionate number of individuals from economically depressed areas with high unemployment. It's not a sea of young IT professionals from Moscow and St. Petersburg. So because the Ukrainian mobilization experience, the call for volunteers and the potential call-up, gives them a much wider cross-section of their community, they do capture very large numbers of technical specialists, people who know how to maintain a motor vehicle, people who know how to operate communications equipment, people who are familiar with technology. So when you see the Ukrainian TDF quicker to innovate with the use of drones or communications technology or being innovative or being able to maintain their own kit and equipment, part of that comes back to the fact that you're calling up people from the educated, the capable, the skilled segments of society, not just those areas where there are a few other options, which is the Russian experience. So where are we now, or at least as time of recording? The Ukrainians claim to have about 700,000 people in army uniforms at the moment, which is a heck of a lot more than the 200-odd thousand they started with. Of course, the ratio between Ukrainians and pro-Russian forces is not as stark as you might think, for a variety of reasons. This includes the fact that you need to account for the pro-Russian proxy forces, you need to account for Wagner Group, you need to account for the work that is being done by people like the railway troops or the internal troops in Russia to support the offensive, which the equivalent work in Ukraine is being done by the Ukrainian army itself. So while the Ukrainian army now probably outnumbers the Russian ground forces, the degree to which it actually outnumbers the Russians at the front is very much up for question, especially as a lot of the individuals who the Ukrainian army has taken in and the TDF has taken in are not yet regarded as trained, equipped, and appropriate and ready for frontline operations. But the expansion is breathtaking, and the number of volunteers is significant. So it does seem as if the primary limiting factor for Ukraine is not going to be willing manpower. It's going to be equipment, and it's going to be training. So let's talk about those now. Because all the volunteers in the world are going to struggle to win a war for you if you have no weapons to give them. So in order to try and work out how much equipment Ukraine might have available, at least in terms of major systems and platforms to issue its troops, I'm going to use 3 different techniques to try and triangulate a reasonable approximation. I'm going to look at sources for how much Ukraine had before the war began, and then adjusted for visually confirmed losses, captures, and known examples of Western resupply. I'm going to look for video and photographic evidence of different equipment systems being in use, and I'm also going to look at the statements that are being made by observers on both sides, on both the pro-Ukrainian side and on the pro-Russian side. In terms of sources, for consistency, pre-war levels of equipment come from Military Balance 2021. Sources for losses come from 2 sources, both the Oryx open source visually confirmed loss database for Russian and Ukrainian equipment, and also from declarations on the Ukrainian side. Specifically, a June statement by Brigadier General Volodymyr Karpenko, who estimated, he didn't disclose, he estimated how much equipment Ukraine may have lost in the major platform categories, so things like tanks and armoured personnel carriers. As we work through this, I'll disclose any further sources and I'll cover caveats at the end. You will notice that Russian Ministry of Defense claims for destroyed Ukrainian hardware are not on the source list, and they're not on the source list for a very clear reason. A relatively regular point of critique on my videos is that I do not use Russian Ministry of Defense figures when estimating losses. Notably, this is not normally a critique that comes from Russians emailing me, it's a critique that comes from English-speaking pro-Russian sources on the internet. And these sources are still used relatively regularly in what you would think of as neutral media. So in markets like India, parts of Asia, parts of Africa and South America, you still see Russian MOD claims being cited as fact or as reliable relatively frequently. Now, I don't use them, I listen to them, but I don't use them, and here is why. Firstly, I'll note that I don't use Ukrainian Ministry of Defense figures either. I think there's a few reasons not to use them. Historically, during conflicts, everyone overclaims. It's just a constant, and official figures are usually junk as a result. Even when they're not deliberately lying, there are lots of reasons that troops at the front are going to claim more enemy equipment destroyed than they actually destroy, often out of genuine belief. So as a starting point, these sort of statistics are not particularly reliable. The Russian statistics are even worse because, logically speaking, they do not make sense. By the 20th of July, Igor Konashenkov stood up on screen and told me that 760 Ukrainian multiple launch rocket systems had been destroyed. Now, Ukraine started the war with maybe 350 of these systems in service, and even if you assume that every single one we know they captured from the Russians was serviceable, the captures plus resupplies do not get you near to 760. The Russians are claiming they have destroyed every MLRS system in Ukrainian service more than once, at least according to the statistics I have available to me. And then, frankly, it gets dumber. Here is a satellite image of Saki Air Base in Crimea. The Russian Ministry of Defense would like you to know that no aviation equipment was destroyed during the detonations on this base. Now, I don't know about you, but it certainly looks like a heck of a lot of aviation equipment has not just been damaged, it has been comprehensively demolished in that image. There's not much credibility here. And even pro-Russian sources out there look at that claim and talk openly about how they feel that lying about something as obvious as this is probably a bad idea. Or here you are, here are some images of HIMARS systems being destroyed. The one on the top left is a truck. The cab looks kind of like a HIMARS cab, but the bolts are in the wrong place, and even worse, there's also a photograph of this image from a different angle which shows them quite happily standing on a truck. And yet this is advanced as a claim they destroyed HIMARS. In the top right, there is an attack on what was a truck with some logs, maybe some shipping containers in what looked like a logging camp, also destroyed HIMARS. And in the bottom left, everyone's favorite, the second story of a building is HIMARS claim. Yes, that image was used as evidence that HIMARS systems had been destroyed. Is it hypothetically possible that a missile system was being concealed on the second story of a building, maybe with some incredible engineering, but that is not exactly compelling evidence? My point is the credibility of the Russian MOD when it comes to destroyed Ukrainian equipment is through the floor. There are reasons from historical precedent not to believe what they say, and there is active evidence that they are lying to us, so I choose to discard them as a source when trying to triangulate reality. I hope that clears that up. So when we look at the Oryx data on visually confirmed Ukrainian losses, as contrasted with equipment that they've captured from the Russians, we can see that there's quite a significant variation between systems. And the extent to which systems are in the negative or positive really hinges on the assumptions you make around what percentage of Russian equipment that the Ukrainians capture can they put back into service. For the purpose of the graph that I'm using on the top right, I have assumed that about 30% of equipment can be put back into service, either by being put back into service itself or enough spare parts being scavengeable from 3 vehicles to put 1 Ukrainian damaged or destroyed vehicle back into service, thus effectively becoming a net +1. And as long as Russia remains Ukraine's primary equipment supplier, the assumptions you make around captures being converted into operational hardware, those assumptions have a major impact on projections. So if you look at these figures, for example, in the top right, the red bars are visually confirmed losses. The green bar is a composite of systems that have been pledged or delivered from overseas allies, plus 30% of systems visually confirmed to have been captured, and the blue bar is the net result between the red and the green bars. So what you see is, in some cases, reasonably positive movements. So Ukraine starts the war with about 850 active tanks. There are between 233 Oryx visually confirmed losses and Karpenko estimating 400 lost tanks. Then there's about 300 estimated resupply vehicles, 281 captured. You assume 30% of those get put back into service, and you end up with a net positive. Also, Ukraine had a large number of tanks in reserve, but that doesn't hold for other systems, and I haven't accounted for reserve equipment on that graph. So for tanks, not including reserves, you end up with an estimate that ranges from -8 to +170. Obviously, you would expect that not all losses would be visually accounted for, so I would estimate towards the lower end of that range using that method. Other systems show pretty clear negative movements. Those things like surface-to-air missiles is one clear example of this. The Russians put a lot of effort into destroying Ukrainian S-300s, and there's only so much Soviet-era anti-aircraft equipment out there that the West has been able to resupply to Ukraine. Other systems are basically entirely new, so they haven't had many losses because they're relatively new introductions and they've been introduced in large numbers. Things like MRAPs, so the Bushmasters and the Wolfhounds that are being introduced to the Ukrainian army, there's obviously been an increase in those systems because they weren't around to be destroyed in the early phases and they're being introduced in large numbers now. But here's the key takeaway across all of these categories. Either Ukraine has lost a percentage of what it began with, or it has gained relatively nominal amounts, like the force has not expanded several times over. If the Ukrainian army started with 200-odd thousand troops and it's now 700,000, none of these equipment categories have multiplied by 3, which is what would happen if you just had a linear scaling of the combat arms. Obviously, that's not how mobilization works, but you can see here, these equipment figures don't match the requirements of massively scaling up the armoured force, the mechanized infantry, or the artillery arms of the Ukrainian military. Instead, most of the time, what this resupply is doing and what these captures are doing is either replacing equipment that has been lost or adding new special capabilities, which is something like HIMARS does. No one has been in a position to just hand Ukraine 6,000 BMP-2s, for example, although I'm pretty sure Estonia would hand them over if they had them. Those findings generally accord with the observed equipment method, where you just go see what you can find visual evidence being in service. And this shows us a couple of things. Remember that we're only ever going to get videos or images of a relatively small sample of the total equipment picture, so we need to be careful with the lessons we take. But in terms of general observations, what we see is a mixture of old and new. We see visual confirmation of the introduction of new weapon systems, so new Western self-propelled guns, new tanks, MRAPs, things like that. We see evidence that a lot of the pre-war systems are still in service, so they clearly haven't all been destroyed by the Russians. And also we see some real trash, like some real Mad Max shit being used by territorial defense forces in certain areas. In terms of new systems, we've got evidence of everyone's favorite, HIMARS. Recently, we've got anti-radiation missiles, so the HARM missile arriving in Ukraine. We have evidence of Western self-propelled guns, so the Panzerhaubitze 2000, the M109, the Krab, etc., etc. The best of these systems are absolutely world-class, and we have copious evidence of them being in use, and we have no credibility to afford to Russian claims that the Western hardware is being destroyed as soon as it enters the country. We also, by the way, have visual evidence of the Ukrainians doing servicing and maintenance on some of this hardware. So to the pro-Russian commentators that were insisting the Ukrainians couldn't do even basic maintenance on the M777, well, there you go. There's Ukrainians doing maintenance on an M777. But of course, we have to keep quantity in mind. There are nowhere near enough of these NATO standard systems to go around, at least yet. Then, of course, we've got a lot of evidence of Ukraine's pre-war stocks or a foreign resupply of Soviet-era equipment. And the evidence there isn't just declarations by countries that they're sending the equipment, it's video and photographic evidence of the Ukrainians actually using the stuff. It's images of the Ukrainians firing their artillery in geolocated locations at the front, and people identifying, for example, Romanian artillery ammunition with a manufacturing date of 2022. So there's a decent amount of evidence here to suggest that at least some units of the Ukrainian Army and Territorial Defence Force have this Warsaw Pact, post-Warsaw Pact equipment available to use, even now after heavy fighting. And by the way, we recently got an image of a TB2, a Bayraktar that had been shot down, and it was identified as one that had been shipped before the war even broke out. So much for the pre-war stock having been entirely destroyed by now. But spend enough time on Twitter and Telegram and you'll see some real Volkssturm shit too. People who have thrown together weapons systems using whatever they can build, borrow or steal. And in a country with a significant manufacturing base, a lot of metalworking industries, a lot of farmers who are used to maintaining their own equipment, it's not surprising you see a lot of ad hoc stuff. We see rocket launchers being taken off, for example, BM-21 Grads or off crashed Russian helicopters and being mounted on the back of pickup trucks, because there is no weapon system other than perhaps the atomic bomb that humans will not mount to the back of a truck. We've got images of second-line units using things like D-44 guns. These are 85mm artillery pieces that went out of production in 1954. And yet, in some cases, they're still in use. The existence of these systems is evidence, I think, that there isn't enough modern equipment to go around. While they look cool, I can't imagine there are many units that would voluntarily choose the rocket-launching version of the Toyota Corolla over something like a HIMARS if one was available. Heck, even a Grad is a significant improvement in terms of the equipment that the vehicle makes available to you. So just keep this bit of evidence in mind as we go forward. And the final point of evidence in this sort of triangulation exercise is the statements that are being made by commentators and officials on both sides. What are the Ukrainians and Russians saying? On the Ukrainian side, it's pretty simple. They debunk the claim that the Russians have destroyed all of the foreign weapons and whatnot, and they put out videos of them being used for obvious reasons. But at the same time, they say they need vastly more, that their mobilization requirements demand many times more systems and much more ammunition than they're currently receiving. In terms of Russian sources, we've talked about Strelkov and Khodorkovsky before. They're aligned with the pro-Russian forces, the proxies in the Donbass. And then I've also looked at some interviews by people like Ruslan Pukov. He's aligned with a think tank very close to the Russian MOD. There's a photo of him standing next to Sergei Shoigu there. I use these sources because they're people who should know what is actually going on, as opposed to English-speaking pro-Russian commentators on Reddit who are pulling it out of their backsides, or at least potentially pulling it out of their backsides. Here's a brief triangulation of common themes across these guys and also a number of the other ones I monitor. Firstly, Ukrainian infantry in general is fairly determined on the defense. Khodorkovsky, Strelkov, Pukov all identified the Ukrainian infantry forces are generally pretty decent. One quote I could find called out the fact that even 2 weeks of training for someone like a territorial defense member will probably give someone enough skills to sit in a trench and resist. Now, that person can probably be thrown out by a skilled assault infantry force, but as these pro-Russian sources generally agree, there are very few competent infantry assault forces left on the Russian side now. The proxy infantry forces are largely exhausted, and it's basically down to Wagner and a couple of units of the regular Russian army, some reinforcements from cannibalized training units, etc., that make up the assault infantry units at this point. Another theme is that the Ukrainians are now largely an infantry and artillery force. The infantry hold the line and the artillery is responsive and causes trouble behind the lines. They don't really talk about the Ukrainians using tanks that much, for example, at least not in an offensive capacity. Pukov also notes that while there are some TDF units out there that look like Volkssturm, they're armed with like Maxim guns and things like that, Generally speaking, that's not the units at the front. The units at the front generally have much better gear, and even if there is a penetration, there tends to be some high-quality units nearby who can counterattack and contain any potential Russian breakthrough. One redeeming factor that they point to is the fact that the Ukrainians often can't concentrate their infantry or launch large-scale operations, because if they attempt to concentrate, the preponderance, the greater number of Russian artillery guns, missile launchers, cruise missiles, and aviation assets makes that concentration very difficult to carry out. So most of these Russian commentators still suggest that Russia enjoys a significant superiority in artillery, but they do call out the presence of modern systems on the Ukrainian side and suggest that generally the Ukrainian infantry that are found actually defending on the line tend to have relatively good equipment and tend to fight in a fairly determined, capable, and competent fashion. So if we put all those different sources together and try and triangulate, what does that give us in terms of a combined picture? I think here are the key takeaways from those sources. The first is that Ukrainian mobilization has primarily generated new light infantry assets or provided replacements and rear area support. It hasn't generated legions upon legions of new tank divisions ready for armoured counteroffensives, but it's given the Ukrainians a lot of bodies to hold positions, to hold towns, to dig trenches, to fortify, and to resist, especially when they're supported by new up-to-date Western artillery systems. On the front lines, units generally have decent infantry equipment, generally, in terms of things like man-pads and ATGMs. This is critical to why the fact that helicopters can't do much in the way of close support, and why tanks are limited in their ability to actually close with the enemy and destroy it, rather than do very long-range indirect fire, as we see the Russians doing in a number of cases. It does seem that there are Ukrainian units out there, it looks like on second and third line duties, that can be much more poorly equipped than the best units out there, and that sometimes these units have been pushed into combat and have suffered as a result. Among volunteer units, as an anecdote and aside, influence does seem to matter. Who can crowdfund the best, who has some contacts, who can find something that's willing to supply the volunteer unit, because unlike the regular army, they're not in the main supply chain a lot of the time. Contrary to the claims of the Russian MOD and some pro-Russian commentators, Russia has clearly not destroyed Ukraine's artillery capabilities, but Ukraine's artillery likewise hasn't scaled with the massive increase in Ukraine's army's manpower. So even if the Ukrainian army now has more troops than the Russian ground forces opposing them, they certainly don't have anywhere near as many artillery cannons or multiple launch rocket systems. It would take thousands of tanks and artillery pieces in order to give this new Ukrainian army that has been mobilized and called up the same average standard of heavy weapons and equipment that existed for the pre-war regular Ukrainian army. And depending on the context, that may be okay. But you are left with an army that has some extremely significant contrasts. On one side, you have a nation which is now operating multiple HIMARS, M270, multiple launch rocket systems with guided munitions capable of launching pinpoint strikes out to 80 kilometers. You have a military that now has advanced anti-radiation missiles, for example. And then you have a military, the same one, that also has volunteers and territorial units that are bolting machine guns to the back of pickup trucks. If that dichotomy doesn't point to the equipment shortages and the bizarre situation that Ukraine now finds itself in mid-mobilization, well, I think it's this image right here. So if Ukraine is to convert this surge of volunteers and new manpower into offensive combat capabilities, what do they need from an equipment standpoint going forward? And obviously the Ukrainian government has put out some pretty loud requests here. So here are just my observations of the things that are probably very high priority. The first one, the clear one, more artillery systems and more ammunition for them. More long-barreled 155s, preferably self-propelled guns, because they have the reach and precision to challenge the Russian artillery in the counter-battery fight, but also more of the smaller 105mm guns that the British and nations like that are sending, because that can replace some of the trash second-line pieces, the 122s and even the 85mm guns that some Ukrainian units are using. They need more secure communications equipment so the guys can coordinate, so that they can work together on the battlefield rather than local autonomous defensive units and without resorting to their cell phones, and so they can still communicate even in environments where local mobile phone coverage has gone down. They need manpads, ATGMs in quantity, obviously, because they need to be able to hand those out to all these infantry units that they're raising. One great way to get military utility out of an infantry force with limited training, you hand them some missile launchers, you hand them some manpads, and at least they can defend themselves from armoured and rotary-winged aviation threats, they can hold a trench, they can hold a position a lot better than if they just had Kalashnikovs and machine guns. We've seen MLRS systems make a difference. Obviously, they're going to need more of them, but also the munitions mix probably needs to expand. They need more GMLRS for more of what they're currently doing. They probably need extended range munitions in order to threaten targets further behind the lines. Whether that's ATACMS or whether that's extended range GMLRS, the options are open, and they could probably benefit from unguided munitions as well if they were going to use them in the same sort of way that you would normally use a GRAD, targeting an area or a position prior to an offensive. A lot more air defense clearly required. You saw on the graph, it's obvious that Ukraine has suffered losses amongst its air defense arsenal, so the arrival of things like IRIS-T and NASAMS is urgent. And then I think there's also need for a uniform infantry transport solution. This has been called out by a couple of resources. Basically, the problem is everyone is sending Ukraine a dozen different systems to move infantry, M113s and all these MRAPs and things like that. What infantry need are preferably one common system or a few common systems that can transport the infantry, allow them to concentrate for offensives, be mobile, and attack without being so damn vulnerable to artillery, but also without driving the maintenance and logistics staff mad. So if the NATO allies can settle on a couple of systems, whether that's M113 or some other system or an MRAP family, something to allow the Ukrainian infantry to move and be mobile and be protected from things like shell splinters without causing the logistics core to off itself, that's probably a good idea. Those priorities and categories, though, are just my opinion based on the information that I have available to me. Please regard them as such. But as much as everyone likes to talk about equipment and high-tech platforms, equipment shortages are only one of the two major challenges that Ukraine faces. The second is actually the challenge being posed to their training system. In the opening stages of the war, training wasn't really that much of an issue. There are a huge number of veterans in the Ukrainian population, and also defensive operations are inherently less complex. As Pukov and some of the Russians have observed, you can give a person 3 weeks weapons training, teach them to dig a ditch, and then hold their ground and shoot any Russians that come into view. If you're talking about territorial defense units defending their own homes and locale, the situation is probably even less demanding. They're going to be very well motivated, but they're also going to have advantages of local knowledge. They're going to know the area, and that's going to give them an advantage even over reasonably trained troops that aren't from there. But as the war now changes and Ukraine tries to launch things other than local, small-scale counterattacks, training becomes a clear bottleneck. You've got new NATO standard weapons that need to be trained on. Troops need to know how to operate these new systems, and maintainers need to know how to keep them functional so you don't have to send them across the border back to Poland every time they need a repair. Yes, that is an option that is available to you. You can send the Panzerhaubitzen back to Germany for servicing, but they're going to be down for a while if you do that. The Ukrainians also increasingly need units that are capable of complex missions, like combined armed offensives. So one phenomenon that we saw amongst the Ukrainians is they would disperse experienced troops to try and train up new recruits, but they'd have to concentrate experienced troops and units when it came time to counterattack, because counterattacking is a more complex activity. You need to coordinate artillery and tanks and infantry, sometimes aviation as well. They require more planning, better coordination, more technical skills. It's in part because of this that Ukrainian forces generally only counterattack at a local level. One of the drivers might be training, but another key driver that could be more important potentially, as the Russians note, is that Russian artillery, with its large numbers, is very threatening to Ukrainians that concentrate in anything like large numbers. So when they start to group up for a potential offensive, if the Russians catch wind of this, the Russian artillery is generally capable of breaking up that concentration, or at least that is the observation I've heard made by both sides. And so the Ukrainians find themselves with a large number of recruits that are very suitable for holding towns or trenches or defensive positions or staging small local counterattacks, but it's harder for them to pull together things like staff officers, experts in combined arms warfare, new experienced tank units, new experienced mechanized infantry units. You can't just teach a guy to be a functional tank platoon commander in a week and a half. And a failure to employ good combined arms strategy when you're using things like armor on the offensive leads to situations like the very high loss rates we saw for the Russian army towards the start of this war. So if Ukraine has an ambition to continue expanding its ability to launch offensive rather than just defensive operations, this training issue, not just the equipment issue, is probably going to have to be addressed. In terms of how they resolve that, Ukraine is looking at a couple of options available to it. The first is foreign training programs, some of which are better known than others. The UK program is probably the most famous. The UK has announced that they want to put roughly 10,000 Ukrainian recruits through an infantry training program every 120 days. So that's 30,000 trained Ukrainian infantrymen coming through British programs every year. That was the initial estimate. Since then, the program has expanded significantly. So Denmark, Finland, New Zealand, Norway, I believe some other countries have all committed to sending additional trainers to help build up that effort, scale it up, to try and give the Ukrainians a larger base of people who are suitable for combat operations, capable infantry operators who can do offensive rather than just defensive maneuvers. You've also got training programs spread across many NATO countries. Usually countries at bare minimum are training Ukrainians on the systems that they are providing. So France provided the training for the Caesar system, Germany provided the training for the PZH 2000, etc., etc. The United States has appropriated $100 million to train Ukrainian pilots to convert over to US and NATO jets. That's one to watch in the latter half of this year and the first part of 2023. Certainly worth calling out. But there's also just quieter training programs that we don't have as much in terms of detail on. There's training being run by the US National Guard for Ukrainian soldiers in German territory, and I'll eat my hat if there aren't significant training activities going on in Poland as well. So what these give Ukraine an opportunity to do is convert something that it has in abundance, which is able-bodied volunteers, into the things that it really needs. People with training and expertise in NATO weapons and also effective combat tactics. At the same time, of course, Ukraine also steps up its efforts to train people within the territory of Ukraine itself, although those training bases always tend to be high-priority targets for Russian cruise missile attacks. The other approach is to just send troops into it and hope that the veterans can teach them how to do their jobs. This is the approach largely taken by the Russian proxies in the Donbass, who observe that the newly mobilized come into service and they either learn from the guys who are experienced or they're in serious trouble. I've seen a lot of claims that the entire Ukrainian pre-war army has basically been destroyed and Ukraine doesn't have any expert soldiers anymore. That's obviously bullshit, even from just a mathematical perspective. If you take the largest reasonable estimates of Ukrainian casualties and assume that all of them applied only to people that were in the TDF or the Ukrainian army before this conflict broke out, there would still be some veterans left over. And obviously, a number of those casualties are in fact people who have been recently called up, volunteers for the TDF, volunteers for standalone units, National Guard Ukraine units, mobilized units of things like the counterintelligence forces or the police forces or the border guards, etc. So there is a significant body of professional soldiers, and there's also a body of volunteers who have now been fighting for several months who can provide information on at least basic skills and competencies to new people who come along. An observation made by some observers and also in an interview with the Ukrainian commander, however, is that the ability to transfer these skills requires units to be rotated off the line. If you're being shelled constantly, there isn't much room to learn. There isn't much time to develop and pass on new skills. Units need to be rotated off the front line and given a break so that the veterans can sit everyone down and teach them what's what. In some cases, this is happening, but it's impossible to tell if it's universal. The other caveat I'll attach here is there are some skills that are hard to learn in the field. Things like staff and command skills, officer training. Military competency isn't like a video game experience point system. You don't get experience points for sitting in your trench firing RPGs at the Russians, and if you do that for long enough, you learn how to plan a combined arm offensive. It doesn't work like that. You have to learn that skill specifically, and that's hard to learn on the front line. So it seems reasonable to me to assess that there is a significant importance attached to formal training structures, because there are limits to how far you can go with, let's call it, on-the-job training. And in some ways, expanding training services might be another way for Western allies who have exhausted their ready arms stockpiles to support Ukraine. Even if smaller countries have run out of artillery ammunition to readily send, they still have experienced and capable troops that are capable of taking Ukrainian raw recruits and training them into capable combat soldiers. In an environment where we have lots of evidence that Russian volunteer battalions are getting 7 days refresher training before going into action, then troops that have had the benefit of several weeks or months of NATO standard training in Europe or the United States are going to have an advantage. And to that extent, the UK program is probably a good start. But if you're going to outstrip casualty rates, and more importantly, if you're going to accommodate the surge of volunteers and mobilized conscripts that Ukraine is going to be able to put into the field going forward, you're going to have to plan for significantly expanding those sorts of initiatives. At the same time, you may not have to train as many people as you think as an observer. Ukraine may have called up 700,000 troops, but not all of those need to be infantrymen. A lot of them are going to work logistics. They're going to drive trucks. They're going to dig trenches. They're going to cook. They're going to do all sorts of support services. They're going to guard and protect journalists. They're going to watch checkpoints. They're going to do the 1,000,001 jobs there are in a military other than combat, tip of the spear, assault the enemy infantrymen. And in that context, it doesn't take that many retrained pilots, that many freshly trained artillery crews converted onto Western systems, that many trained infantrymen, or that many newly trained officers in order to make a very significant difference. You don't need to put everyone through these courses, but they will be of great benefit to those that are going to go into combat. But I've spoken for a long while now, and it's time to tie this all together. What does all this mean? It means the Ukrainian mobilization system, a shit show though it was, did what it needed to do in the early stages of the war. It generated a large mass of resisting infantry, reservists, and volunteers who could take over various roles, free up regular units, and help blunt the initial Russian offensives by their actions. Since those initial weeks and months, the system has continued to allow the Ukrainians to feed in reinforcements and to continue to scale up their manpower reserves in order to absorb losses and fight the sort of attritional war that they have been fighting so far. At a time where Russia has been really scraping the barrel for volunteers and infantry replacements, Ukraine has at least had manpower in reserve. And the introduction of relatively simple to use weapon systems like anti-tank guided missiles and manpads have given these mobilized infantry forces the tools they need to defend themselves from systems like helicopters and systems like tanks. When adequately supported by the Ukrainian artillery, and that's the asterisk, when adequately supported by the Ukrainian artillery, Russian observers note that these newly mobilized Ukrainian infantry forces with those weapons are capable of providing a serious defensive barrier to everything except the most concentrated Russian offensive spearheaded by the best assault troops. And generally morale has held well. There are units that break, there are units that suffer combat fatigue, there are units that refuse to go to the front, just as there are on the Russian side. But in general, Ukraine's defenders have held together incredibly well. They have stood their ground under grinding artillery bombardments and against an opponent with a massive superiority in armour, artillery, and aviation assets, and they have ground them down over the course of months. If morale had not held the way it had, we would see the impact on the map with the Russians making considerably more gains than they have. You don't advance at 50 meters a day against an opponent that breaks. The difficulty the Ukrainians are likely facing is converting this pool of volunteer and conscript manpower into new combat units that are capable of large-scale combined arms offensives. Yes, history includes some examples. The Korean War and the Chinese short attack tactics are an example here of you being able to attack using light infantry against a more heavily armed opponent, but that usually involves taking very heavy casualties yourself, which isn't consistent with the broader Ukrainian strategy of attrition. Offensive operations require a lot more equipment, specialized skills in terms of things like coordination, communication, planning, and staff work. And with the current equipment and training situation, Ukraine is not yet at the point where most of its newly formed units are suitable for those sorts of operations. Although they may be suitable for freeing those units which are capable of such operations, those reserve units that can pull those sort of maneuvers off, freeing them up from defensive duties so they can go do those sort of operations. Broadly, I would make this observation about the two sides. Russia tries desperately to scrounge up new infantry and new manpower in order to allow it to leverage its massive advantages in air forces, in artillery and armour. It has the guns and the missile launchers and the aviation assets to pound the Ukrainian front line relentlessly. What it needs is the infantry to go then dig the Ukrainians out of their position, and it's struggling to find it. The Ukrainians, by contrast, need to find aviation assets, artillery, and armour to enable them to fully use their mass of infantry. They have the troops, they have the manpower, but they need the supporting arms, the artillery, the armour, and the aviation, and the anti-aircraft assets to enable them to concentrate and launch offensives without suffering disproportionate casualties. They're diametrically opposed challenges. Now, Ukraine can adopt certain tactics and techniques to mitigate the requirement for those supporting arms, but I don't have any desire to go into those here, and I'm really not the person with the base of expertise to be providing those recommendations anyway. The problems that Ukraine faces can hypothetically be addressed, probably more easily than the Russian manpower issue, although that really depends on the techniques that Russia is willing to deploy in order to get more people into uniform. We saw the impact that foreign training had on the Ukrainian army between 2014 and 2022, for example. What is called for now is more of that, but on a much larger scale, while the Ukrainians scale up their own training efforts within the country. They obviously also need the equipment to go with that training and enable them to make the most of their new skills. All of that, however, requires foreign support. Ukrainians have proven willing to defend their country. They have volunteered by their hundreds of thousands, and they've proven willing to fight even in circumstances where they're tremendously outgunned. In order to convert that army into one that is capable of taking large offensive actions and pushing Russia towards a possible peace deal, well, that depends on a constant and expanded supply of munitions and training assistance from Ukraine's allies. And so my prognosis for the war remains very similar to the one that I originally made in March, that the outcome owes a lot to the willingness of the Ukrainian people to resist, the willingness of the Russians to endure pain in order to pursue victory, and importantly, the willingness of the West to make sacrifices in order to support Ukraine in their fight. So in conclusion, the Ukrainian mobilization efforts may have been a bit of a shit show, but they enjoyed a high degree of enthusiasm. They may have been haphazard, but they did succeed in putting very large numbers of troops into the territorial defense or the Ukrainian army, or into the various volunteer and militia units that sprang up across the country. Mobilization generated hundreds of thousands of new troops that were suitable for support and light infantry duty, and the demography of the country and what we can tell about Ukrainian morale suggests that there is still additional mobilization potential. If Ukraine is given equipment and training, then it can provide the troops willing to use those things. But for the moment at least, the shortages of equipment and the difficulties in providing training to such large numbers of new recruits does raise questions over the ability of most of the Ukrainian armed forces, other than specific units, to carry out coordinated large-scale offensive activities. In order to bring more units up to that standard, Ukraine really needs three things: time, equipment, and training. Okay, channel update to close out. First things first, thank you to everyone who joined the Patreon, especially in the last week. There was a big surge of you, and I will do my best to respond to all the new messages and new joiners over the course of the coming week. I also had a new sponsor, Morning Brew, come on board this week, which is obviously a big help. And since I'm thanking people, I'm going to call out my long-suffering sound guy here, who has asked not to be identified, but he has put up with my terrible equipment and terrible acoustics for far too long. All Bling No Basics was originally recorded on a second-tier gaming headset microphone and went through no audio processing whatsoever. If you listen to the difference in sound quality then versus now, you will see all the evidence of my sound guy's assistance. Frankly, when it comes to sound processing, I don't have a clue what I'm doing. When I brief to rooms of people, not to microphones. So his assistance really has been absolutely critical, and I thank him for it. In terms of upcoming topics, there are a couple that have been flagged that I'm now working on, and there are two specifically that I want to talk about. The first is a lot of requests for me to cover topics relating to Australia, our submarine deals, our procurement frameworks. I'm sorry, I will not be covering topics on Australia. I can't. So there are plenty of other commentators out there that cover it, and I'd encourage you to look there. Secondly, a lot of requests for me to look and comment on issues relating to the Taiwan Strait and China. I'm not really keen to bandwagon and hypothesize on potential cross-strait tensions, and I know there are other commentators out there with more relevant expertise who are willing to do so. So again, I'll leave that space to them. What I am considering doing that may be relevant is I can break apart the Chinese military budget and do some analysis around Chinese military modernization and procurement strategy over the last decade or so. I think a lot of commentators tend to undersell the strength of the Chinese military and the success of its modernization. I'm happy to address things from that angle. I just don't want to touch the Taiwan issue. Now, there are other topics that are in the works. My patrons would know this, but these are two that get requested on a regular basis, and I did want to call them out here. A real thanks to everyone as always, including those who have volunteered to help with subtitling. I've contacted a few more of you today, and I'm hoping to enlist some serious progress in the coming week. I'll have an update on that. Thank you to everyone for your comments, your engagement, and your support through various vectors. I genuinely appreciate it, and I will see you all again next week.